Alright, welcome to Transformations of f of x to g of x, Level 1. Now, in our very first example, it's simply asking us to describe the transformation of f of x to g of x. And notice we're given this, f of x equals the square root of x plus 8, and I'm going to use a different color to represent g of x. What is g of x? Well, g of x is, we're going to take f of x, and we're simply going to subtract 2. So hopefully using this different color will kind of show you what is f of x and what is g of x. So I'm going to write my second line, g of x equals, and notice here we have this f of x, and instead of writing f of x, we want to write out what is f of x. Well, f of x is the square root of x plus 8. And notice that when we see g of x, and we see that minus 2, well, that is simply just being subtracted with the whole function. It's outside of everything important. And so when we look at this, we know that g of x is going to be g of x equals the square root of x. And then we ask ourselves, well, what is 8 minus 2? Well, that would be 6. So we can now kind of compare our g of x function, and we compare that to our f of x function. And notice the only difference is that f of x was plus 8 and g of x is plus 6. So you want to ask yourself, okay, when this constant is outside the function, or aka outside of this square root right there, is it shifting us left or right or up or down? And in this case, when it's being added or subtracted to the entire function, it's going to be shifting us up or down. Now notice that we went from positive 8 to positive 6. So I'd ask myself, did I increase or decrease, and by how much? We know that 8 minus 6 is 2, and so we shifted down 2 units. Alright, let's go ahead and try another example. Alright, here in example 2, it's asking us to describe the change in f of x to g of x. And you'll notice that f of x is equal to x plus 3, and the whole thing's being squared. And then, of course, we have our g of x. And remember, I'm going to use a different color to annotate g of x. So g of x is equal to f of x plus 8. And once again, notice we're adding that 8 to the outside of the entire function. So when we go to write g of x equals, well, I'm still going to write f of x, the function that it is, in white. And we know that f of x is this right here, x plus 3, and the whole thing being squared. Switching back to my g of x color, we're just saying, hey, we're going to add 8 to the outside of this entire function. Now notice, this case is actually simpler than the last. There's nothing to add the 8 to, since that plus 3 is kind of inside the function f of x. And so this is our final function. Now the question you have to ask is, what number was out here? In this specific case, since we don't see a number, we know it's like saying plus 0. And we want to ask, from f of x to g of x, going from 0 to 8, how much did we change by? And in this case, we would say that we increased by 8 units. Remember, when you're outside the function, you're shifting up or down exactly as you think it would. So we would say that this shifted up 8 units. Okay, pause it, look over these notes, and let's go ahead and move on to our second. Okay, looking at example 3, we have the same type of problem where we want to describe f of x to g of x, and notice our f of x function is a whole lot more complicated this time around. We have f of x equals 8 cubic roots of x plus 4 plus 5, and our g of x is equal to f of x minus 7. So let's go ahead and get started. We have g of x equals, and shifting back to white to represent this f of x, what is f of x? Well, it's this entire function, 8 cubic roots of x plus 4 plus 5. Now the question that we have to ask ourselves is, this negative 7, is it being subtracted from the x value specifically, or is it being subtracted from the entire function? In this case, we see that it's been subtracted from the entire function. So we're just going to tack on that minus 7 right over here. Now when you look at this, the only things that can actually combine are these terms outside of the cubic root function. And so we can write g of x equals 8 cubic roots of x plus 4. And ask yourself, well, what is 5 minus 7? And 5 minus 7, that would be negative 2. Now when I look at g of x, I notice that outside of this, the only thing that has changed from f of x is we went from a positive 5 to a negative 2. So did this increase or decrease? Well, since it decreased, we know that we shifted down. And the question is by how much? Well, we know that negative 2 minus 5, negative 2 minus 5 is negative 7. So we shifted down 7 units. Alright, let's conclude level 1, and I'll see y'all in our level 2 video.